He stepped into the snow and was gone.
There are stories that don't make it into history books. They aren't taught in schools or written down in family records. Instead, they stay where they began. Passed from one winter night to the next, carried in whispers and remembered because no one ever found an answer. This is one of those stories. It happened in Quincy, Illinois, in the winter of 1878. And if you ask the oldest families still living near the edge of that town, they'll tell you the same thing. He didn't run away. He didn't fall. He just vanished. The boy's name was Charles Ashmore. He was 16 years old, quiet, respectful. One of those boys who did what was asked without complaint, but who never spoke more than he needed to. It was late, already dark, and cold enough that the snow squeaked beneath your boots. His father had asked him to fetch water from the well, which stood just a little way behind the house. It wasn't far, maybe 15 paces through the yard. Charles put on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped out into the stillness. That was the last time anyone saw him. After a few minutes passed, his father grew uneasy. There hadn't been the usual sound of the bucket scraping the stone or the creak of the rope. No footsteps returning. No voice calling out. He opened the door and looked across the yard, expecting to see his son struggling with a frozen handle or wrestling with the rope in the cold. Instead, he saw only snow and footprints. A single clear line of boot prints stretching from the porch across the yard and ending abruptly halfway to the well. There were no scuffs, no signs of a fall, no marks leading away in any direction, just a clean path of steps. And then nothing. They called out to him again and again, but there was no answer, not a sound, not even the echo of someone running off. They searched for hours that night, and for days after. Neighbors joined. Dogs were brought in. They searched the woods, the stream beds, the frozen edges of the property. But there was nothing. No scent, no clothing, no broken branches. The snow was untouched, except for those footprints, still visible days later, still ending in the same impossible place. It was as if something had taken him, not dragged, not chased, just lifted him out of the world mid-step, without a sound. Several weeks passed, and although the family had given up the search, the silence around the house hadn't left. Then, one afternoon, his sister said she'd heard him. She had gone out near the well, not to look, but simply to stand there, as if waiting for a sign. And she heard his voice. She said it wasn't faint or distorted. It wasn't in her head. It was clear, close, as if he were standing a few feet behind her, calling her name in the same tired, familiar tone he'd always used. When she turned around, no one was there. But the voice continued, repeating her name, not in fear or desperation, but like someone lost in the fog, waiting for someone else to answer. Others came to listen. Some said they heard it too, some didn't. But over the course of a week, the voice grew weaker, until eventually it stopped. The Ashmore family never moved. They lived out their years on that property, but they never used the old well again. They had another one built further from the house, and to this day, no one quite knows why. They just say that the air around it never felt right after that night, like something stayed behind, watching, or waiting. Some people claim the whole story was made up, a bit of small-town folklore to explain a runaway boy. But those who knew Charles, who stood in the snow that night and saw those footprints with their own eyes, they don't believe that, because snow doesn't lie. And footsteps don't just stop. Not unless something stops them. It's been nearly 150 years. No one alive remembers the boy. But the story still lingers in Quincy. And when the snow falls fresh and the wind dies down, there are still people who say that, just for a moment. They hear a voice in the cold, calling from nowhere. Not a cry, not a whisper, just a name, half remembered in the dark. And then, nothing.
The Passenger in Bay 4.
Every town has places people stop using, and no one can quite explain why. Sometimes it's an alley, sometimes it's a house. In our town, it was Bay 4 at the old bus station. No sign ever went up, no warning was given. But over time, people stopped parking there. And when you ask the night drivers why, they just shake their heads and say, no one likes being on that route after 2 a.m. Back in the early 2000s, the town still had an overnight route, a single bus line that ran through the outer loop, mostly for hospital staff and the occasional factory shift. Bay 4 was its usual departure point. One night, a driver took the 2:30 a.m. departure. There were no scheduled pickups, no one waiting. He scanned the dashboard. Empty. Closed the door. Pulled out. About 15 minutes into the drive, he looked into the rearview mirror and saw someone sitting in the back row. A man, still, upright, not moving. He hadn't come on at the station. No stop button had been pressed. No one had seen him board. At first, the driver thought maybe someone had slipped on quietly, or that he'd missed them during his walkthrough. But there was something off. The man sat too straight, didn't shift, didn't blink, just stared ahead unmoving as if the seat were part of him. When the driver stopped at the end of the route and turned on the interior lights to let passengers off, the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. No one had stepped off. There was no one to be seen. Per policy, they pulled the internal video. And that's where things got strange. There was nothing unusual at the beginning. The cabin was empty. The lights flickered as usual, but nothing out of place. Until around 2:41 a.m. Just after a turn near the edge of town, the camera glitched slightly. A flicker, then static for a frame, and then a faint human-shaped blur sitting in the back row. It never moved, never stood, never looked up, just faded in. And later, faded out. At first, they wrote it off as a glitch, bad sensor, poor lighting, compression errors. But then it happened again and again. Different drivers, different nights, always in Bay 4, always after 2:40 a.m. Some saw nothing. Some refused to speak about it. One quit 2 weeks after a sighting without turning in his badge. An older driver said he'd seen the figure once. He thought he recognized the man. Said he looked like a passenger who used to take that route every Thursday night years ago. A man who died quietly on the bus during a winter storm. Heart attack, they said. By the time the driver realized he hadn't moved for the last 6 stops, he was already gone. No one really remembered his name, just that he'd always sat in the back row and never spoke to anyone. They eventually reassigned the route, changed schedules, switched bays, but sometimes, due to backups or construction, Bay 4 is still used, and every once in a while, a driver will mention something, a glimpse in the mirror, a quiet, lingering shape just outside the glow of the cabin lights, not menacing, not violent, just there, waiting. There's no sign on Bay 4, no plaque, no story in the newspaper, just a few old drivers who still shake their heads when someone asks if it's safe to park there after midnight. They won't tell you not to. They'll just look at you for a second too long and say, just check your rear view and don't expect anyone to get off.